From my grandfather versus decency and a mild temper. From what they say and I remember of my natural father, integrity and manliness. From my mother, piety, generosity, the avoidance of wrongdoing and even the thought of it. Also simplicity of living, well clear of the habits of the rich. This is how Marcus Aurelius describes how he was imbued with Stoic values in his meditations. But what does he actually mean? Is being a Stoic this simple? How do we know when we have reached that goal? Throughout my degree in philosophy, I have seen many different frameworks be discussed. Each have their own merits and flaws, and many are more popular than others. I have read the texts of Marcus Aurelius, and I found it to have a unique viewpoint, but Stoicism truly never stood out to me during my studies. So it was surprising for me to see its surge in popularity in recent years, especially in online spaces. Within the social media world, Stoicism is often linked to fictional characters, mainly to show perceived desirable character traits that those with the interest in the topic wish to possess. And in many ways, there's nothing wrong with this. In general, young people tend to lack direction regarding what type of person they want to be, or how they would mould themselves into that person. So, it's not really a surprise that the idea of a strong male that frequently appears in Stoicism is popular with a young male demographic. But, as all philosophies regarding character are, how we may actually become a true Stoic appears a bit confusing. Those with an interest can become disheartened at the realization they may never be able to inhabit the inhumanly perfect nature that fictional characters associated with Stoicism possess. But what if there wasn't a need to feel distressed by this thought? What if you could be a Stoic even with flaws? Today, I will tell you what it takes to label yourself a true Stoic, and what fictional characters we should think of when trying to become it. So first we need to think about what Stoicism actually is. It's thrown around a lot in media, typically presenting the strong, silent and brooding male protagonist of fiction. But do people really know what they mean when they ascribe this to a character or person? Or are they just throwing the term around? Today many seem to only focus on the work of Marcus Aurelius when discussing Stoicism. Even my understanding of the topic was completely based on what I had read in his meditations. And while Stoicism was very much alive and thriving during his time, its history goes back to a decent amount of time before Rome even existed. The creation of Stoicism is credited to a philosopher named Zeno of Citium, who lived in ancient Greece around 300 BC. It was originally called Zenoism, but the Stoics did not want their philosophy to become a cult of personality. They recognised that even smart and talented individuals like Zeno were capable of making mistakes, and should they commit an act which is frowned upon, it would look pretty bad and would taint the philosophy. So the name Stoicism was chosen. It derives from the ancient Greek for painted porch. I think they said this would likely refer to a decorated colonnade located in the Gora in Athens, where Zeno gathered with pupils and other philosophers to discuss philosophy. But the history isn't really that important. We're trying to discuss what Stoicism actually is. In essence, Stoics believe in the self-improvement of one's logical skills. Their reason for this was they thought that the universe operated according to logic, and if you possessed greater logical skills, you can have stronger and a more unified account of the world and how it operates. At its core, Stoicism is constructed from these logical skills that improve from rational discourse, so debate, discussion. And these logical skills can then be used to consider two main points. Firstly, the spiritual and the physical are one. And this is not referring to spiritual in terms of ghosts, but sort of an essence of being. And then we can use logic to understand and improve how our mind and character interact with the world. Secondly, using logic to consider naturalistic ethics. So we'd be identifying how both natural features of humans and our moral laws that we as humans try to abide by can interact. The Stoics believe that by using logic to consider the 2 points mentioned, we can cultivate virtue, was their ultimate end goal. In a more simple way, the Stoics believed that we had to cultivate a logical being to live a virtuous life. So we now know that becoming virtuous would be our end goal for a Stoic. However, this begs the question of how we can know if we've reached the goal, because virtue is kind of arbitrary. We can't really say when we are virtuous and when we are not, and when we have become a virtuous being. According to Stoics, by cultivating self-control, a calm, problem-solving state of mind, and overall rational judgment, we may become virtuous. They claim that anxiety, passion, insecurities are the misguided actions that we should seek to limit through these practices. And that by aligning our morals with nature, we can align our sense with reason, with the rational order that the universe seemingly possesses. So we must live with our morals aligned with nature, work to improve our emotional self-control, and remove our insecurities. Only then can we be, by the Stoic definition, virtuous. So, obviously from this, it appears Stoicism has a strong reliance on logic. And it makes sense. The person who calmly considers all factors is likely to reason the best action to take. Inwood wrote something about this. He said, with logic, a person can reason on their practical affairs, can stand their ground amid confusion, differentiate the certain from the problematic. And I think that's pretty obvious, and I think that's pretty well said, to be honest. So the desire to be logical is reasonable, but practically, we're still not really clear how we can achieve this. So the Stoics break it down a bit more on how we become this logical person. For them, the study of logic is educating oneself on language, grammar, rhetoric, and epistemology. The first three make a lot of sense, as without understanding what people mean when they speak and what nuance can be gathered from what they are saying behind their actual words, how can we reasonably understand and then logically process our interactions with others? The study of epistemology is the inquiry into what knowledge is and how we acquire it, making it the most obvious subject matter of the bunch. With greater knowledge in all things, we can make more logical decisions. Hopefully, from this, it becomes quite clear that Stoicism has a clear method and goal that we must achieve. We must become more logical to become a more virtuous person. It doesn't necessarily seem so far out of reach. It is something that we are all reasonably capable of. So why is it that we may feel it's difficult to ever describe ourselves as Stoic? The reason I think that we may find it difficult to describe ourselves as Stoic is our depictions of Stoicism in media. When you look up the phrase Stoic fictional characters online, several examples appear. These are core examples of how the Stoic character is portrayed to us, serving as a clear image within our minds of what those in pursuit of possessing a virtuous character are attempting to work towards. However, I think the way that Stoicism is portrayed to us is a bit wrong, to be honest. Not in the concept that these characters possess a Stoic nature, but if these are the examples which we are drawn to if we wish to possess that nature, it can often appear impossible or maybe even unattainable. So, one of the first characters suggested online was Spock from Star Trek, and maybe this is an older character that if there are young people maybe not too familiar with, I assume people would know the name, but for those unaware, Star Trek is a science fiction series that aired in 1966 with iterations of it continuing to be published to this day, to be honest. It's set in the 23rd century, follows the crew of the USS Enterprise in their travels through space, and their mission is simply to go where no man has gone before. The core cast is made up with a host of characters, and most are officers on the ship that we just mentioned, but one of the main characters is Spock. he is half Vulcan and half human, which often causes some internal conflict for himself. For those unaware, again, Vulcans are a humanoid species, often denoted by sort of pointed elven ears, and they have a logical and calm personality. Spock serves the role of both the science officer and first officer of the USS Enterprise. I think this role emphasizes his supreme intelligence. In a fictional universe of thousands of alien species and numerous advances in technology and science, being assigned the role of science officer means the audience automatically perceives Spock as possessing a supreme intelligence compared to both the crew and ourselves. This reflects the Stoic requirement to study knowledge and improve one's own. So you can see why people may think he's Stoic. His role of first officer is essential within the show. After Captain Kirk, Spock holds the ultimate command among the crew. This tells the audience the value of his logical skills, and that in a supposedly advanced society, this skill is highly valued and rewarded, serving a perfect example of how the Stoics are rewarded in their value of logic. One of the core traits often associated with the Vulcan culture is the claim that Vulcans never lie. This makes sense, as a logical species would see little value or reason to not tell the truth, as is often the best way to solve a problem if everyone has all the information. Stoicism itself is considered the assessment of ascertaining truths from lies, again making Spock a true Stoic. However, throughout the multiple iterations of Spock, he lies on several occasions, even when it does not make logical sense to lie. If it's to save his crewmates from harm, he's likely to do so, but I guess this could be attributed to his less logical human side, as he's not a full Vulcan. Spock himself would often justify his lying by deeming it a tactical necessity, thus making it a logical action to take. So, even by being dishonest, Spock may not weaken the inherent Stoic virtue that his character appears to possess. So I've just outlined how Spock exhibits the Stoic principles that the philosophers of ancient Greece suggested, mainly being that he's valued for his logic and knowledge through his position of authority among an important team within a fictional universe which far exceeds our knowledge of our own universe. So why do I think this is a poor image for us to possess within our mind when we want to become Stoic? Well, to be honest, it's mainly because Spock isn't human. Thus, it's not a goal we as humans can reasonably achieve. And I know what people want to say, but he's still half human, he isn't perfect. Well, my reply to that is, even if he is affected by his human DNA, which I've already admitted to, much of the Stoic character traits that he possesses are attributed to his Vulcan heritage. When flaws in his logic appear, they are either attributed to his human DNA or labelled a tactical decision, thus negating any criticism of his logical ability. Even considering the fact that Vulcans are not naturally more or less intelligent than the average human, they are still raised in a culture which places heavy emphasis on the cultivation of knowledge and the improvement of logical skills. I will admit that within our own society there is a reasonable expectation that we develop a similar method, but it cannot be fairly compared to an advanced society with greater knowledge than our own, built on these principles. Therefore, while Spock is a concrete figure of Stoic virtue, I maintain my view that he is not an adequate or fair example of what an aspiring Stoic should envisage. Moving on, I can imagine the statement, but you just used an example of an alien. There are plenty of examples of Stoic characters which are grounded in our reality. And I agree. So, I will now discuss a more realistic example proposed in my search. Atticus Finch, the faithful lawyer and father in the fictional novel To Kill a Mockingbird. So I read this book in English class in school, so he's not a character who's unfamiliar to me. But for the sake of the video, I will quickly just say a bit about the book and who Atticus is himself. So, To Kill a Mockingbird was written by Harper Lee in the 1960s. It's set in the 1930s and it's told through the eyes of a young girl named Scout Finch as her father, Atticus Finch, defends Tom Robinson against rape allegation. The trial is spotlighted by the simple fact that Tom Robinson is a black man, making this accusation an assured guilty verdict for him. For the purpose of this video, no further context on the book is really required. However, it is an incredible story regarding racism and prejudice in the Deep South, and I'd highly recommend. In regards to Atticus Finch, he's well received among the people of the town. He's seen as well educated, intelligent, and importantly, a logical man. Which is why those around him are surprised when he steps forward to represent Tom Robinson. Atticus is also a loving and involved father with his 2 children. He raises them by himself after the loss of his wife prior to the novel's beginning. So, why do I think that Atticus Finch was suggested by the internet to me as a figure of Stoic virtue? Firstly, he is written with the same emotionally controlled disposition that the aforementioned Spock possesses. Even when faced with immense hatred for his choice to defend Tom Robinson, he remains collected. Rarely does he lose his temper, and even then it can be perceived as a justified emotion. For example, when Tom Robinson is eventually found guilty, despite the insurmountable evidence that Atticus clearly identifies as just reasoning for considering him innocent, Atticus does lose his temper, but it quickly returns to his balanced self. I believe that this can be perceived as mainly due to anger emerging at the illogical conclusion that the jury have arrived at, followed by the logical realization that the jury was so fueled by racism that they would have found Tom guilty no matter what argument Atticus presented. Another reason I can conceive of for viewing Atticus as a Stoic is for the simple fact that he decided to take on the case in the first place. As mentioned, Atticus was well respected prior to this decision. By taking the case, he opened himself up to the scrutiny and hatred of those around him. But he viewed his decision as just. He logically assessed that just because Tom Robinson was black, he was not automatically guilty, and anyone who is innocent should be defended to the best of any lawyer's ability. By abiding by the logical skills of the Stoic, he understood that it was right for him to take the case, and using his advanced knowledge defended him to the best of his ability. My final reason for labelling Atticus Stoic goes beyond facing the scrutiny of those around him. He was willing to face harm upon himself in order to complete his task of defending Tom. At one point within the book, just before Tom's trial begins, an angry and armed mob approach where he was being held, intending to kill Tom before the trial even started. Atticus, with his advanced knowledge and logical skills, perceived that this threat would arise and waited all night outside the cell to ensure Tom's safety. When the mob ordered Atticus to clear the path to Tom, Atticus refused, stating that they would have to cause Atticus great harm before they even got close to the cell. The mob, unwilling to harm a white man, did not face Atticus' challenge and left the scene quickly. Atticus' defense of Tom can be attributed to stoicism, as he used his logical skills to realize that no harm would befall Tom should he be willing to risk his own safety for his sake. Overall, Atticus displays exceptional Stoic values, while being a much better concept of what we should work towards in comparison to Spock, due to his character being heavily grounded within our own reality. So why do I think he still fails as an adequate goal? Primarily for the final feature of his Stoic nature, which I identified: his willingness to risk harm upon himself. Logically, it makes sense. He understood that those willing to harm Tom would most likely be unwilling to harm him. Setting aside the fact that logically this was a big risk, as if Atticus was also killed alongside Tom for defending him, his 2 children would have been left with no parents to raise them, meaning Atticus would fail in his duty to care for his children. For us to expect those of us aiming towards the goal of becoming a Stoic to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice is unrealistic. The average person does not want to make risks like these. They want to become wiser and more emotionally resilient, not willing to risk their own lives even if it is for the cause they deem as right. So while some aspects of Atticus' character are fair goals for our aspiring Stoics to aim for, His character as a whole is not one I would want members of our society to reach for in their quest for stoicism. There are abundance of characters who are considered stoic who I can criticise for the same reason I criticise both Spock and Atticus. Gandalf and Dumbledore are both willing to make the same self-sacrifice that Atticus was willing to make. Yoda is seen as a wise sage, yet he has lived for 900 years. So of course his logic and knowledge would far exceed our own. Beyond that, at least Spock is half human. We don't even know what Yoda is. I mean, he's actually like a little green guy, isn't he? I'm sure that I could find stoic fictional characters that we definitely should not be using as our own goals forever. But that's not the point of the video. So, we need to find a fictional character that we can have within our minds as a realistic goal for us to work towards. Before I get into this section, I have to be honest, I planned this video without being sure which characters I would use as examples, which meant that when getting to this section, I was still really unsure of who the realistic Stoic would be. And I actually did not realise how long it would take and how many loopholes and small technicalities I had to consider to find what I believe to be the correct answer. And the answer is within the show Avatar, The Last Airbender. The character Iroh, or Uncle Iroh, is famous among fans of the show. On top of this, he's one of my favourite fictional characters, and I'm sure you'll see why. Normally I would explain the plot for anyone who hasn't seen the show, but I can just play the intro and the gist should be pretty easy to get.
Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Only the Avatar, master of all four elements, could stop them. But when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years passed and my brother and I discovered the new Avatar, an airbender named Aang. And although his airbending skills are great, he has a lot to learn before he's ready to save anyone. But I believe Aang can save the world.
The only detail I would add to this is when it's mentioned that the Fire Nation attacked, it didn't specify that the Airbenders were the first nation attacked, and in a single night the Fire Nation wiped out all Airbenders other than Aang. The brutal genocide is important to mention, as I want it to be clear to all of the audience that the Fire Nation possesses a really cruel nature, and it's, in all honesty, the exact opposite of a virtuous stoic one. Which brings into question why I would suggest Iroh, who is a member of this cruel Fire Nation. This criticism can be emphasised even more when considering the fact that Iroh isn't just a member of the Fire Nation. He was at one point the first in line to the throne of the Empire. However, Iroh's nation in the show does not reflect most of what the Fire Nation believes. He is an older, calmer and knowledgeable man, with a particular fondness of jasmine tea. He is a mentor to his nephew Zuko, who was excommunicated from the Fire Nation homeland while he attempts to trace the whereabouts of the Avatar. One of the reasons I think we should consider Iroh stoic is when you think of the fact that he almost became the Fire Lord. The reason that Iroh did not become the next Fire Lord, even though he was first in line, is because of an event before the start of the series where Iroh was a general for the Fire Army. Iroh was besieging the strongest city in the Earth Kingdom called Ba Sing Se. During this time it's theorised that he had a fearsome and more brutal nature, emphasised by his moniker, the Dragon of the West. However, during the siege, Iroh's son Lu Ten died. This broke Iroh, who left the city and retreated back to the Fire Nation, unable to continue his duties as a general. Seeing Iroh broken, his brother Ozai made a suggestion to the Fire Lord Azulon, their father. Arlon no longer had any heirs to the throne, and he was too upset to ever be a strong Fire Lord, too soft, too broken. Azulon was disgusted by the idea of betraying his son, the firstborn, especially while he was grieving the loss of his son, Lu Ten. But Ozai did not give up. He was desperate to become emperor, so he poisoned Azulon. He then assumed the position of Fire Lord, and Iroh, being too consumed by grief, did not question or fight his brother's ascension to the throne. I think the demise of Iroh's son is really important for outlining the stoic nature of Iroh. I have already mentioned how Iroh was a fearsome general, the Dragon of the West, and he was an all-powerful prince destined to continue the Fire Nation's cruel expansion. But the horrific grief he experienced changed him. As mentioned, the Stoics encouraged the studying of epistemology. By experiencing the emotions from losing a child, and the realization that should he have not been so keen to conquer the city, his son may have lived. By expanding the knowledge of emotions, his nature shifted from a dominant soldier to a wise sage, hoping to help others and one day put an end to the war, thus denoting the turning point towards becoming a virtuous Stoic for Iroh. Although I've criticised characters who are not fully believable as realistic humans being used as examples, and Iroh himself possesses superhuman abilities, I don't believe that this excludes him from consideration. Iroh rarely uses his abilities from what we can see within the show, and if he does, it is usually to defend or train others. Spock's non-human lineage has a direct effect on his character and actions, thus it has a direct effect on his stoic nature. In comparison, Iroh's stoic nature comes from the character he possesses, which is separate from his abilities. Thus, his stoic nature is not influenced by them. If anything, his shift from a soldier to an advisor demonstrates his disillusion with his abilities as a rule set for his life. So we are still able to envisage Iroh as our stoic example. I really want to emphasize the significance of Iroh's lack of reliance on his abilities. The core goal of the protagonist Aang is to defeat Iroh's brother, the Fire Lord Ozai, and stop the war. As a monk, Aang is against violence, but he knows that as the Avatar, he is one of the only people who may be able to defeat Ozai. Aang fears the challenge greatly, even though the Avatar is greatly revered for their strength. However, within the show, it states that Iroh himself may be another contender for potentially defeating the Fire Lord. While we never really see the full extent of Iroh's power, the fact that he's considered to be on a similar level of Ozai and Aang tells us that even though Iroh is on this level, his lack of reliance on his abilities is a testament to his stoic nature. Iroh directly mirrors stoic practices when he tells Zuko to learn to control only what you can and understand that events occurring outside of this are not your own fault. He knows that his nephew is not the strongest, so if he wants to succeed, he must be a master of what he already possesses. In this sense, not trying to learn new techniques, but mastering the basics of firebending, making use of the allies around him and outsmarting his opponents. Iroh also never adopts irrational attitudes, just as the Stoics preach. Multiple times throughout the show, he is imprisoned. He could have used his ability to escape while hurting others. Instead, he adopts a calm attitude. He is friendly with his guards, then uses his abilities to escape without harming others to the best of his ability. Most importantly, Iroh practices forgiveness better than any fictional character I know. Multiple times, Zuko runs from his uncle, or acts in a way that he would not approve of. He knows that his nephew does not act out of being a bad person, but out of ignorance of the situation he is in. When they finally reunite after Zuko's worst betrayal of Iroh, Zuko is shocked that his uncle is willing to forgive him. Iroh states, "Pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source." He understands that nobody is born stoic, but they must work to become it. This is why he is willing to forgive Zuko for his mistakes. He understands that mistakes are part of growing into a virtuous person. Overall, being a Stoic is typically presented in media as the cold, unfeeling, brave character. But I have outlined that it is simply the studying of knowledge to improve one's reasoning and thus become a kinder person. But our depictions in media often skew examples of how we can reach this goal and what it may practically look like. We could never have the reasoning skills of Spock with our fully human nature, nor should we ever be reasonably expected to make the ultimate self-sacrifice as Atticus Finch was willing to do. But Iroh avoids the pitfalls that so many fictional characters succumb to. He doesn't rely on anything beyond human nature to be stoic, nor is he expected to act outside of his ability, nor does he expect it from others. He forgives those who hurt him because he sees that they too could one day be virtuous. So if you like stoicism, and you think I would like to become more virtuous like how the ancient Stoics described, I want you to imagine Iroh. When faced with any decision, think, what would Iroh do? For Iroh is a true Stoic.